The laughter in the room stopped so suddenly that even the air felt frozen. A few seconds earlier, people had been whispering cruel jokes behind their glasses of sparkling juice, shaking their heads at the woman standing near the back wall in a faded blue dress. Some pitied her. Most mocked her. And when the organizers called her name and paired her with a tired single father, no one expected anything meaningful to happen. They thought he would politely smile, avoid eye contact, and leave as quickly as possible like every other man had done before. But instead, the single dad looked at her as if he had just found something priceless in a world that had taken too much from him already. And when tears filled his eyes, the entire room fell silent. Before we continue, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, Wisdom Story House, if you believe kindness and second chances can change someone's life forever. Stories like this remind us that the people the world overlooks are often the ones carrying the most beautiful hearts. Morning sunlight spilled across the busy streets of Belmere City while Nolan Mercer balanced a paper coffee cup in one hand and held his little daughter Ivy's backpack in the other. The city moved around them in loud, impatient waves, but Nolan walked with the exhaustion of a man who had stopped expecting life to slow down for him. At 38 years old, his face carried the tiredness of sleepless nights, overdue bills, and years spent pretending he was stronger than he really felt. 3 years earlier, his wife had died suddenly after a severe illness, leaving him with a 7-year-old daughter and a silence inside his apartment that no amount of television noise could fill. Every morning followed the same pattern. He woke before sunrise, prepared Ivy's lunch, rushed her to school, and spent 10 hours repairing elevators in old office buildings across the city. By evening, he returned home with aching hands and barely enough energy to smile. Yet he still forced himself to sit beside Ivy while she colored pictures or practiced reading aloud because he feared she would notice the sadness he tried so hard to bury. The people around Nolan admired him in the shallow way society often admires struggling parents. They called him brave, hardworking, devoted. But admiration did not make loneliness disappear. It did not stop the nights when he sat awake staring at family photographs while wondering how long a person could survive carrying grief alone. One afternoon, Ivy's teacher pulled Nolan aside after school and gently suggested he attend a community gathering hosted by a local support organization for widowed parents and socially isolated adults. Nolan almost laughed at the idea. He hated gatherings. He hated forced conversations even more. But Ivy overheard the conversation and squeezed his hand tightly, her small eyes hopeful in a way that broke him. A week later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Nolan found himself standing outside the Grand Alder Community Hall, adjusting the sleeves of his worn gray shirt while people entered in groups around him. The event was meant to encourage friendship and companionship among people rebuilding their lives after loss, rejection, or hardship. Volunteers had decorated the hall with yellow flowers and paper lanterns that glowed softly under the daytime light pouring through tall windows. Everything looked cheerful, but Nolan felt painfully out of place. Inside the hall, conversations floated everywhere. Couples laughed politely. Organizers introduced strangers to one another. Some people carried hidden sadness behind perfect smiles. Others seemed desperate to prove they were doing fine. Nolan stayed near the refreshment table, hoping the afternoon would pass quickly. That was when he noticed the woman everyone else seemed determined not to notice kindly. Her name was Mirelle Vance. She stood near the far wall, clutching a small purse against her chest while pretending to study the decorations. She looked older than her 34 years because life had not treated her gently. A thin scar stretched across one side of her jaw, the result of a terrible car accident years earlier. Her dress was simple and slightly outdated, and her nervous posture made her appear even smaller than she was. Groups of women whispered when she walked by. A few men glanced at her before immediately looking away. One cruel voice near Nolan quietly muttered that the organizers must have become desperate if they were inviting women like her now. Nolan looked toward Mirelle again and noticed something that pierced his heart instantly. She was trying very hard not to cry. There was a familiar pain in her expression, the kind worn by people who had spent years being treated as invisible. Nolan understood that look because he had seen it in his own mirror after his wife's funeral, when neighbors stopped visiting and friends slowly disappeared back into their comfortable lives. As the event continued, the host announced a pairing activity designed to encourage deeper conversations. Participants would be randomly matched for lunch and storytelling exercises. Groans and nervous laughter spread through the hall. Nolan considered leaving immediately. Then the host called his name. Nolan Mercer. A volunteer smiled and pointed toward Mirelle across the room. And your partner will be Mirelle Vance. The reaction was immediate. Several people exchanged awkward glances. Someone near the back snickered softly. Another person whispered something cruel enough to make others cover uncomfortable smiles behind their cups. Mirelle lowered her eyes at once, clearly expecting rejection. Nolan felt anger rise inside him faster than he could explain. Not because he had been paired with her, but because the entire room had already decided she was unworthy of basic dignity. He walked across the hall slowly until he stood in front of her. Up close, he noticed how tightly she held her purse just to stop her trembling hands from shaking. Her eyes carried years of humiliation, loneliness, and quiet endurance. Then something unexpected happened. Nolan smiled. Not the forced smile people use out of pity, but a warm genuine smile that reached his exhausted eyes. And for a moment, Mirelle looked completely stunned. They sat together near the tall windows where sunlight painted soft golden lines across the tablecloth. At first, conversation came awkwardly. Mirelle spoke quietly about working at a bookstore downtown. Nolan talked about Ivy and his repair job. But little by little, the walls between them began to crack. Mirelle admitted she avoided social events because people often treated her differently after the accident changed her appearance. Before the crash, she had been engaged to marry a man who disappeared from her life during her recovery. Friends slowly stopped calling. Invitations vanished. Even relatives treated her like a reminder of tragedy instead of a person. Nolan listened carefully, his chest tightening with every word. She explained how she had learned to survive humiliation by pretending it no longer hurt, though deep down every laugh and every stare still wounded her deeply. Yet despite everything, she still volunteered at children's literacy programs every weekend because she believed lonely children deserved kindness. That sentence shattered something inside Nolan. The room around them faded while he imagined this woman, rejected by society, still choosing compassion instead of bitterness. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed of how quickly people judged one another based on scars they could see while ignoring the wounds hidden inside everyone else. As Mirelle nervously apologized for talking too much, Nolan suddenly reached across the table and gently covered her trembling hand with his own. Tears instantly filled his eyes. Not polite tears. Not dramatic tears meant for attention. These were the tears of a man who had carried grief alone for too long and had unexpectedly found another soul who understood suffering without needing explanations. The hall fell quiet again. People stared openly now because they could see something real unfolding between two wounded strangers everyone had underestimated. Nolan looked directly at Mirelle and softly told her that she was the strongest person he had met in years. Mirelle's lips trembled as if she had forgotten how kindness sounded. By the time the afternoon ended, Nolan walked her to the bus stop outside the hall. Daylight still warmed the sidewalks while traffic hummed around them. Neither wanted the conversation to end. For the first time since his wife's death, Nolan felt lighter. Not healed, not magically transformed, but understood. Over the following months, Mirelle slowly became part of Nolan and Ivy's world. At first, Ivy was shy around her. But Mirelle brought books from the store and spent afternoons reading adventure stories beside her on park benches under bright afternoon skies. She listened patiently to Ivy's endless questions and helped braid her hair before school events. Nolan watched these small moments carefully, feeling emotions he had buried for years slowly return to life. Yet not everyone welcomed their growing bond. Some neighbors whispered cruel comments about Nolan settling. A coworker once joked that loneliness must have made him desperate. Even Nolan's older brother questioned whether Mirelle's appearance would make life harder for Ivy socially. But Nolan no longer cared about shallow opinions. Because every evening, when he looked at Mirelle laughing softly while helping Ivy with homework at the kitchen table, he saw something rare and beautiful. He saw a woman who had survived cruelty without losing her gentleness. And slowly, Mirelle began changing too. The fear in her eyes faded. She stopped apologizing for speaking. She started wearing brighter colors. Sometimes Nolan caught her smiling at her own reflection as if she were finally beginning to recognize herself again. One bright spring afternoon, nearly a year after they first met, Nolan invited Mirelle and Ivy to the same community hall where everything had begun. The organization was hosting another daytime celebration for local families. Mirelle hesitated before entering the building. Memories of humiliation still lingered there. But the moment they stepped inside, something unexpected happened. Several volunteers rushed over warmly. They had heard about Nolan and Mirelle through mutual friends and knew how much they had helped each other heal. One older woman hugged Mirelle tightly and thanked her for volunteering at literacy events with struggling children. The same room that once echoed with mockery now filled with admiration. Then Nolan surprised everyone. In front of the gathered crowd, beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns and afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, he took Mirelle's hands and spoke openly about the day they first met. He admitted he had entered that hall emotionally broken and numb to life. But while everyone else saw a woman to mock, he had seen extraordinary courage. He said Mirelle taught him that scars do not ruin beauty, they reveal survival. He confessed that she had restored warmth to a home filled with grief and had given both him and Ivy a reason to laugh again. By the time he reached into his pocket and revealed a small silver ring, people throughout the hall were openly crying. Mirelle covered her mouth in shock while tears streamed down her face. Nolan's voice cracked as he asked her to spend the rest of her life with him and Ivy. And for the first time in years, Mirelle no longer looked like someone hiding from the world. She looked loved. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House. Stories like these remind us that real beauty lives in kindness, loyalty, and the courage to love people others overlook. Special request: comment below where you are watching from and share one act of kindness that changed your life forever. As applause filled the hall that afternoon, many people lowered their heads in shame remembering the cruel whispers they once shared about Mirelle. But Nolan did not care about their guilt anymore. Because while others judged scars, he had discovered the soul beneath them. And in a world obsessed with perfection, two broken people had found something far more valuable: a love built not on appearance, status, or approval, but on understanding, compassion, and healing. Long after the celebration ended and the golden daylight faded outside the hall windows, Nolan stood beside Mirelle watching Ivy run laughing across the sidewalk ahead of them. The city still rushed around them the same way it always had. Life was still imperfect. Bills still existed. Grief had not disappeared completely. But for the first time in many years, none of them felt alone anymore. And sometimes, that kind of love is enough to save a life.